The pastor's voice was still echoing through St. Andrew's Chapel when my sister Catherine stood up in the third pew, her black dress rustling against the wooden bench as she cleared her throat with the kind of deliberate authority that meant she was about to say something that would change everything. "Before we lay David to rest," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed congregation, "there's something everyone needs to know. My son Tyler isn't just David's nephew. He's David's son." The gasps that followed were nothing compared to the shock that rippled through the chapel when Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope sealed with red wax. "And David left him everything in this will that nobody knew existed." What I discovered in that document would shatter not only my understanding of my marriage, but everything I thought I knew about the sister I'd trusted with my deepest secrets for 43 years. But let me start from the beginning. Because this story isn't just about betrayal or secret wills, it's about the lies we tell ourselves about the people we love, and what happens when those lies finally crumble under the weight of truth. David and I had been married for 18 years when he died suddenly of a heart attack at 51, leaving me a widow at 45 with 2 teenage children, and a life that felt like it had been torn in half without warning. We'd built what I thought was a solid, honest marriage, based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep friendship that survives the inevitable challenges of raising children and building careers. David was a successful architect who specialized in historic preservation, spending his days bringing new life to old buildings while maintaining their character and integrity. It was work that reflected his personality, thoughtful, patient, and committed to honoring the past while creating space for the future. He'd designed the renovation of our town's historic courthouse, the restoration of the old Carnegie Library, and dozens of residential projects that had helped preserve the Victorian character of our small Ohio town. I worked as a high school guidance counselor, helping teenagers navigate the complicated transition from childhood to adulthood while dealing with college applications, family conflicts, and the universal challenge of figuring out who they wanted to become. It was demanding work that required patience, empathy, and the ability to see potential in young people who didn't always see it in themselves. Our children, Emma now 17 and Jake 15, were typical teenagers dealing with typical teenage problems: homework, friendships, college prep, and the ongoing negotiation of independence that defines the high school years. David had been a devoted father who attended every soccer game, school play, and parent-teacher conference, always making time for the kids despite his demanding career. From the outside, we looked like a successful middle-class family with a stable marriage, healthy children, and deep roots in our community. David served on the Historic Preservation Commission. I volunteered with the Literacy Council, and we hosted an annual 4th of July barbecue that brought together neighbors, colleagues, and extended family for food, games, and the kind of relaxed socializing that builds community connections. My sister Catherine had always been a central part of our family gatherings and social circle. 3 years older than me, Catherine had moved back to our hometown after her divorce 8 years ago, bringing her then 10-year-old son Tyler to live in the house next door to ours that had belonged to our grandmother. Catherine worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave her flexibility to be present for Tyler's school events and activities, while building a client base that included several local businesses and nonprofit organizations. She was talented, creative, and had developed a reputation for understanding exactly what clients needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. Tyler, now 18 and just graduated from high school, had grown up as much in our house as in his own. He'd eaten dinner with us several nights a week, joined our family vacations to the lake, and spent countless afternoons doing homework at our kitchen table while Catherine worked late on design projects. David had embraced his role as Tyler's uncle with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else. He'd taught Tyler to throw a baseball, helped him build a treehouse in our backyard, and served as a male role model during the difficult years following Catherine's divorce from Tyler's father, Marcus. Marcus had been largely absent from Tyler's life since the divorce, paying child support sporadically and visiting even less frequently. He'd remarried and started a new family in California, leaving Catherine to raise Tyler essentially as a single parent with support from our extended family. David's involvement in Tyler's life had been a blessing for everyone involved. Tyler clearly looked up to his uncle, seeking his advice about everything from school projects to college plans. David enjoyed having another young person to mentor, and his guidance had helped Tyler develop confidence and direction during his teenage years. Emma and Jake had grown up treating Tyler like an older brother, and the three kids had developed the kind of easy, affectionate relationship that made family gatherings fun and relaxed. Tyler often served as a bridge between our teenage children and David, translating teenage concerns into language that parents could understand, and helping resolve conflicts with the perspective of someone who was young enough to remember being 15, but old enough to see the bigger picture. Catherine and I had always been close, sharing the kind of sisterly bond that had survived childhood rivalry, teenage drama, and the inevitable differences that develop as adults build separate lives. We talked on the phone several times a week, shared childcare responsibilities when one of us traveled for work, and maintained the kind of honest communication that allowed us to support each other through both celebrations and crises. When Catherine went through her divorce, I'd been her primary source of emotional support, listening to her process the pain of watching her marriage fall apart while trying to protect Tyler from the worst of the conflict. When David and I struggled with infertility for several years before Emma was born, Catherine had been the one who held me while I cried after each failed pregnancy test, and who celebrated with genuine joy when we finally succeeded. Our families were so intertwined that neighbors often commented on how unusual it was to see siblings maintain such close relationships into adulthood. Catherine's house was an extension of ours, and ours was an extension of hers. The kids moved freely between both homes. We shared lawnmowers and tools, and holiday celebrations involved both families working together to create traditions that honored our shared history while building new memories. David's sudden death had been devastating for all of us, but Catherine had been my anchor during the immediate crisis. She'd handled the funeral arrangements, coordinated with David's colleagues and clients, and managed the dozens of practical details that death requires while I struggled with grief and shock. She'd also been Tyler's primary source of comfort during his own grief process. Tyler had been closer to David than to his own father, and losing his uncle felt like losing the most important male figure in his life during a crucial transition period before starting college. The funeral had been planned as a celebration of David's life and contributions to our community. St. Andrew's Chapel was filled with family, friends, colleagues, and clients whose lives had been touched by David's work or personality. The pastor had delivered a thoughtful eulogy that captured David's integrity, creativity, and commitment to both family and community. Emma and Jake had each spoken about their father, sharing memories that made people laugh and cry while painting a picture of a man who had been fully present in his children's lives. Several of David's colleagues had shared stories about his professional work and his mentorship of younger architects. The service had been proceeding exactly as planned, until Catherine stood up during the final moments before we were scheduled to process to the cemetery. Her announcement had been delivered with the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd been planning this moment carefully, but the content of her words had hit the congregation like a physical blow. "My son Tyler isn't just David's nephew, he's David's son." The immediate silence had been deafening, followed by a wave of gasps, whispers, and shocked exclamations as people processed what Catherine had just revealed. I'd felt the world tilt sideways, my vision blurring as I tried to understand what my sister was saying and why she was saying it at David's funeral. Emma and Jake, sitting beside me in the front pew, had turned to stare at me with expressions of confusion and growing horror as they began to grasp the implications of Catherine's announcement. Tyler, sitting with Catherine, had looked as shocked as everyone else, his face pale and his mouth open as he realized his entire understanding of his parentage was being rewritten in front of 200 people. But Catherine hadn't been finished. She'd reached into her purse and pulled out the manila envelope, holding it up so everyone in the chapel could see it. "David left Tyler everything in this will that nobody knew existed," she'd continued, her voice steady despite the chaos her previous announcement had created. "A will that acknowledges Tyler as his son and leaves him the house, the business, and all the assets that everyone assumed would go to his other children." The second revelation had been even more shocking than the first. Not only was Catherine claiming that David had been Tyler's father, a claim that rewrote 18 years of family history, but she was also claiming that David had created a secret will that disinherited Emma and Jake in favor of the son whose existence he'd apparently never acknowledged publicly. The pastor had attempted to restore order, asking Catherine to please take her seat so the service could continue, but the damage had been done. The funeral had dissolved into whispered conversations, shocked stares, and the kind of confused chaos that occurs when fundamental assumptions about reality are suddenly challenged. I'd somehow managed to get through the remainder of the service and the burial at Woodlawn Cemetery, moving through the rituals like a sleepwalker while my mind struggled to process what Catherine had revealed. Emma and Jake had stayed close to my side, clearly shaken by their aunt's announcement, but looking to me for guidance about how to respond to information that challenged everything they thought they knew about their family. The reception following the burial had been surreal, with guests approaching me to offer condolences while clearly wanting to ask about Catherine's announcement. I'd deflected questions as best I could, claiming that I needed time to process the information before discussing it publicly. Catherine had left immediately after the burial, taking Tyler with her and avoiding the reception entirely. Her absence had probably been wise, given the shocked and sometimes angry reactions her announcement had generated among family members and friends who felt she'd chosen an inappropriate time and place for such revelations. That evening, after the last guests had left, and Emma and Jake had gone to their rooms to process their own shock and grief, I'd sat alone in the living room that David and I had shared for 18 years, staring at the manila envelope that Catherine had pressed into my hands as she'd left the cemetery. The envelope was sealed with red wax that bore the impression of David's architectural seal, a detail that suggested authenticity, but also raised questions about when and why this document had been created. David's regular will, which we'd updated just 2 years earlier, was filed with our attorney and contained no mention of Tyler or any provisions that would disinherit Emma and Jake. I'd opened the envelope with trembling hands, not sure whether I wanted to discover that Catherine was telling the truth or that she was perpetrating some kind of elaborate deception for reasons I couldn't understand. The document inside was professionally prepared and bore all the legal markings of a legitimate will. It was dated 6 months before David's death and contained provisions that matched Catherine's description exactly. According to the secret will, David acknowledged Tyler as his biological son and left him the house where Emma, Jake, and I lived, David's architectural firm, and all of David's financial assets, including life insurance policies and retirement accounts. Emma and Jake were mentioned only briefly, with provisions for college tuition, but no other inheritance. The will also contained a letter addressed to me, written in David's handwriting and explaining his reasoning for the provisions he'd made. "Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and Catherine has revealed the truth about Tyler's parentage. I know this will be shocking and painful, and I'm sorry that you're learning about it this way." The letter continued with details that confirmed Catherine's claim about Tyler's parentage, while providing context that explained how the situation had developed. Tyler was conceived during a brief period when Catherine and Marcus were separated, and you and I were going through our own difficult time trying to get pregnant with Emma. Catherine and I both made mistakes that we regretted immediately, but by the time we realized Catherine was pregnant, she and Marcus had reconciled, and it seemed better for everyone to let Marcus believe he was Tyler's father. The letter went on to explain that David had provided financial support for Tyler throughout his childhood, through anonymous contributions to Catherine's household expenses, and that he'd deliberately involved himself in Tyler's life as an uncle to maintain a relationship with his son, without disrupting the family dynamics that had developed. I've watched Tyler grow into a remarkable young man, and I've been proud to be part of his life, even if I couldn't acknowledge him as my son publicly. The provisions I've made for him in this will are an attempt to ensure his future, while recognizing the responsibility I've had for his welfare all along. The letter concluded with David's explanation for why he'd chosen to disinherit Emma and Jake in favor of Tyler. Emma and Jake have had the benefit of growing up in a stable 2-parent household with all the advantages that my success has provided. Tyler has grown up essentially without a father, supported by Catherine's sacrifices and my secret assistance. This will is my attempt to balance those inequities and ensure that Tyler has the same opportunities for success that Emma and Jake have enjoyed. As I'd read David's letter, I'd felt my understanding of my marriage, my family, and my sister shifting in ways that were both devastating and confusing. The man I'd been married to for 18 years had been keeping fundamental secrets about his relationship with my sister and his financial obligations to her son. The sister I'd trusted with my deepest secrets had been lying to me about the most basic facts of her son's identity. But more than the betrayal and deception, I'd been struggling with the implications of the secret will for Emma and Jake's futures. According to the document Catherine had revealed, my children would lose their home, their father's business, and the financial security we'd all assumed would support their college educations and early adult years. As I'd sat in my living room reading David's final confession, I'd realized that Catherine's decision to reveal the secret at David's funeral hadn't been spontaneous or emotional. It had been strategic and calculated, designed to establish Tyler's claim to David's estate before anyone could challenge or question the legitimacy of the secret will. The battle for David's legacy was about to begin, and I wasn't sure whether I was fighting for my children's inheritance or for my understanding of who my husband and sister really were. The confrontation I'd been dreading came the next morning, when Catherine arrived at my front door at 8 o'clock with Tyler in tow and the determined expression of someone who had come to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. I answered the door still in my robe, having spent most of the night reading and rereading David's secret will, and trying to process the magnitude of the deception that had been unfolding in my life for 18 years. Emma and Jake were still asleep upstairs, exhausted by yesterday's emotional trauma, and probably hoping that this morning would somehow make sense of revelations that had shattered their understanding of their family. "We need to talk," Catherine said without preamble, stepping into my foyer with the kind of confidence that suggested she felt entitled to be there. Tyler followed behind her, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with me in a way that suggested he was as confused and overwhelmed by yesterday's revelations as everyone else. I led them into the living room where I'd spent most of the night, the coffee table still covered with the papers from David's secret will and the notes I'd been making as I tried to understand the legal implications of what Catherine had revealed. "Sarah," Catherine began, settling into David's favorite chair with a familiarity that now felt like an invasion. "I know yesterday was shocking, but I need you to understand that I never wanted things to happen this way." The words were clearly meant to sound apologetic, but her tone carried no real remorse, only the kind of defensive justification that people use when they're trying to make themselves feel better about actions they know were wrong. "How exactly did you want things to happen?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger that had been building since I'd finished reading David's letter. "At what point were you planning to tell me that you'd been lying to me about Tyler's parentage for 18 years? Catherine shifted uncomfortably in David's chair, clearly unprepared for the directness of my response. She'd probably expected me to be more shocked and less focused, easier to manipulate during the emotional chaos that followed David's death. "It wasn't supposed to be a secret forever," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "David and I always planned to tell you eventually, when the time was right." "When would the time have been right?" I pressed. "When Tyler turned 18? When he graduated from college? When David died and you needed to claim his inheritance?" The implication that Catherine had been motivated by financial considerations rather than honesty clearly stung, and when she responded, her defensive mask slipped slightly to reveal something harder underneath. "This isn't about money," she said sharply. "This is about Tyler finally getting the recognition and support that he deserves as David's son." Tyler, who had been sitting silently on the couch during this exchange, finally spoke up with a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Mom," he said, "I don't understand any of this. Yesterday you told me that Marcus wasn't my real father, and that Uncle David was. Today you're talking about inheritance and recognition. I just want to understand what's true and what isn't." The pain in Tyler's voice was heartbreaking. At 18, he was dealing not only with the death of the man who had been the most important father figure in his life, but also with the revelation that their relationship had been based on a fundamental deception. His entire understanding of his identity and family history had been rewritten in the space of a single day. Catherine's expression softened when she looked at Tyler, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw genuine emotion rather than calculated strategy in her face. "Everything about how much David loved you was true," she told Tyler gently. "The only thing that wasn't true was letting you believe he was just your uncle instead of your father." "But why?" Tyler asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why didn't he want people to know I was his son? Was he ashamed of me?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see Catherine struggling with how to explain a situation that had been created by adult decisions that a teenager couldn't be expected to understand or accept. "David wasn't ashamed of you," I said, speaking to Tyler directly for the first time since Catherine's revelation. "According to his letter, He and your mother made the decision to keep the truth secret because your parents were trying to reconcile, and it seemed like the best option for everyone at the time. Tyler turned to look at me with eyes that were red, with unshed tears and confusion that went deeper than grief. "Aunt Sarah," he said, then stopped and corrected himself. "I don't even know what to call you anymore. If David was my father, what does that make you? What does that make Emma and Jake?" The question revealed the full scope of how Catherine's revelation had disrupted not just legal relationships, but the emotional bonds that had defined our family for Tyler's entire life. He'd grown up calling me aunt and thinking of Emma and Jake as cousins, but if David was his father, then I was his stepmother and Emma and Jake were his half-siblings. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," I told Tyler. "The relationships we've built over 18 years don't change because we've learned new information about genetics." Catherine seemed to interpret my response to Tyler as acceptance of her claims, because her posture relaxed slightly, and she leaned forward with the kind of earnest expression that she used when she was trying to be persuasive. "That's exactly right," she said. "Our family relationships don't have to change just because we're finally being honest about Tyler's parentage. We can all continue to be close while acknowledging the truth about who Tyler really is." "And what about David's will?" I asked. "Are we supposed to continue being close while Tyler inherits everything and Emma and Jake lose their home and their father's business?" The question clearly made Catherine uncomfortable, but she'd obviously been preparing for this conversation and had her arguments ready. "David made those provisions because he wanted to ensure Tyler's future," she said. "Emma and Jake have had 18 years of advantages that Tyler never had. They've lived in this beautiful house. They've had a father who was present every day. They've had financial security and educational opportunities that Tyler had to work for on his own. Tyler has had all those things too," I replied. "He's eaten dinner at this table several nights a week for the past 8 years. David helped him with homework, attended his school events, and provided guidance and support in exactly the same ways he supported Emma and Jake. But not as his father," Catherine insisted. "Tyler has grown up knowing that his real father didn't want him and that the man who did care about him couldn't acknowledge him publicly. Do you have any idea what that does to a child's sense of self-worth?" The accusation that David's secrecy had damaged Tyler emotionally was probably fair, but it was also manipulative in the context of discussing inheritance. Catherine was using Tyler's psychological well-being to justify financial decisions that would devastate Emma and Jake. "Catherine," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the frustration building in my chest, "I understand that Tyler has been hurt by the secrecy around his parentage, but punishing Emma and Jake for decisions that adults made before they were born isn't going to heal that hurt." "This isn't about punishment," Catherine replied. "This is about fairness. David acknowledged in his will that Emma and Jake have had advantages that Tyler didn't have, and he tried to balance that inequality. By taking away their home and their father's business?" I asked. "By eliminating their college funds and their financial security? How is that fair to them?" Catherine's response revealed the fundamental selfishness underlying her position. "Emma and Jake have you," she said simply. "They have a mother who can support them and guide them through college and early adulthood. Tyler only had David, and now David is gone. This inheritance is Tyler's only security for the future." The implication that I was somehow a less important parent than David, or that my ability to support my children was less valuable than an inheritance, was both insulting and revealing. Catherine seemed to view David's assets as Tyler's entitlement, rather than as resources that should be distributed fairly among all of David's children. "Tyler also has you," I pointed out, "and he has the 18 years of relationship building that David invested in him, plus whatever financial support David was providing secretly all along. That's not the same as having a father who acknowledges you publicly and leaves you an inheritance that reflects your value to him," Catherine argued. The conversation was going in circles, with Catherine justifying the secret will based on Tyler's emotional needs, while I tried to point out the unfairness of disinheriting Emma and Jake for circumstances beyond their control. But it was Tyler who broke the deadlock by asking the question that neither Catherine nor I had been willing to address directly. "What if I don't want the inheritance?" he said quietly. "What if I don't want Emma and Jake to lose their home because of something I didn't even know about until yesterday?" Catherine turned to stare at Tyler with an expression of shock and dismay, clearly not having anticipated that he might reject the inheritance she'd been fighting to claim on his behalf. "Tyler," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone that parents use when they think their children are making foolish decisions. You don't understand what you're saying. This inheritance represents your father's recognition of you and his desire to provide for your future. You can't just give that away. But it's not just about me, Tyler replied, his voice growing stronger as he worked through his thoughts. Emma and Jake are my family too. I've spent more time in this house than in my own house. I've done homework at that kitchen table, watched movies on that couch, celebrated birthdays and holidays in this living room. This is as much my home as it is theirs. Tyler's response revealed a maturity and empathy that was remarkable for someone who had just learned that his entire understanding of his family was based on deception. Instead of embracing the financial windfall that Catherine was claiming on his behalf, he was considering the impact of that inheritance on the relationships that had actually shaped his life. Tyler, Catherine said, her voice rising with frustration, Emma and Jake will be fine. They'll go to college. They'll build careers. They'll have successful lives with or without this inheritance. But you're starting from nothing. Your biological father has never supported you. You don't have a college fund. And you don't have any financial safety net except what David provided for you. I have what David already gave me, Tyler said firmly. I have 18 years of love and guidance and support. I have the confidence and skills he helped me develop. I have a family that cares about me. I don't need his money to prove that he loved me. The wisdom in Tyler's response was stunning, and it revealed that David's most important legacy to his son wasn't financial. It was the character and values that Tyler was demonstrating in this moment of crisis. Catherine's reaction to Tyler's rejection of the inheritance was swift and angry. You're 18 years old, she said sharply. You don't understand the realities of the world or the importance of financial security. You can't make decisions about your future based on teenage emotions and misguided loyalty. I'm not making decisions based on emotions, Tyler replied calmly. I'm making decisions based on what I think is right. The exchange between Catherine and Tyler was revealing the fundamental difference in their approaches to the inheritance situation. Catherine saw David's will as vindication and financial opportunity, while Tyler saw it as a moral dilemma that required him to choose between personal gain and family loyalty. But before Tyler could say anything more, we heard footsteps on the stairs, and Emma and Jake appeared in the living room doorway, clearly having been awakened by the raised voices of our conversation. Emma, 17 and already showing the kind of mature judgment that would serve her well in college and beyond, looked around the room and immediately grasped the situation. Are you here to kick us out of our house? She asked Catherine directly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that reminded me of David at his best. Catherine's face flushed with embarrassment at being confronted so directly by her niece, or stepdaughter, depending on how you interpreted the new family dynamics. Emma, Catherine said, clearly struggling to find the right tone for this conversation, nobody wants to kick you out of anywhere. We're trying to figure out how to honor your father's wishes while being fair to everyone involved. Dad's wishes were for us to live in this house and for him to leave his business to his children, Jake said, speaking up for the first time since entering the room. If Tyler is his son too, then maybe Tyler should get part of the business, but that doesn't mean we should lose everything. Jake's response showed the same mature thinking that Tyler had demonstrated, suggesting that all three teenagers were more capable of finding fair solutions than the adults who were supposed to be guiding them. That's not how wills work, Catherine said, but her voice lacked conviction. David made specific provisions that need to be honored as he wrote them. David made provisions in a secret will that nobody knew about, I said firmly, a will that contradicts the official will that was filed with our attorney, and that was based on deception and secrecy rather than honest family communication. Catherine's response revealed that she'd been preparing for this challenge to the secret will's legitimacy. The secret will is dated 6 months after your official will, she said, pulling out a folder of documents that she'd clearly brought for this conversation. That makes it the more recent expression of David's wishes, and legally, it supersedes any previous wills. The fact that Catherine had come prepared with legal documentation suggested that she'd been planning this confrontation carefully, and that she had no intention of backing down from her claim to David's estate. But I'd been doing my own research since reading the secret will, and I had questions about its legitimacy that went beyond the timing of its creation. Catherine, I said, I've been David's wife for 18 years. I've been involved in every major financial decision, every legal document, and every estate planning discussion we've ever had. I find it very difficult to believe that David would create a will that disinherited our children without ever discussing it with me. David was protecting you from information that would have been painful, Catherine replied. He knew that learning about Tyler's parentage would hurt you, and he didn't want to cause that pain until it was absolutely necessary. Or, I said, someone created a forged will and is using Tyler's parentage as a way to make that forgery seem legitimate. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Catherine's face harden with anger at the suggestion that she might be perpetrating fraud. "Are you accusing me of forging David's will?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm saying that I have questions about the authenticity of a document that nobody knew existed until after David's death," I replied. "Questions that are going to require legal investigation before any inheritance decisions are made." Catherine stood up abruptly, gathering her papers with sharp, angry movements that suggested this conversation was over. "Fine," she said. "If you want to make this a legal battle, then that's what it will be. But Tyler is David's son. That will is legitimate, and we're not going to be cheated out of what David wanted Tyler to have." As Catherine and Tyler left my house, I realized that the family relationships that had been the foundation of our lives for 18 years were about to be tested in ways that might destroy them completely. The battle for David's legacy was no longer about inheritance. It was about truth, loyalty, and whether love could survive the revelation of fundamental deception. The investigation that would unravel Catherine's deception began 3 days later in the office of David Morrison, our family attorney, who had been handling our legal affairs for over a decade. David Morrison was no relation to my late husband, despite sharing his first name, a coincidence that had always amused both men during their professional relationship. I'd called Morrison immediately after Catherine's threatening visit, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the secret will and its implications for David's estate. Morrison had been as shocked as everyone else by Catherine's funeral revelation, and he'd agreed to prioritize our situation given the complexity of the legal and family issues involved. "Sarah," Morrison said as I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, "I've reviewed the document that Catherine provided to you, and I have to say that it raises several red flags from a legal perspective." Morrison was a careful, methodical attorney who had earned his reputation by being thorough rather than flashy. His office reflected his personality: organized, professional, and filled with law books and case files that suggested someone who did his research before drawing conclusions. "What kind of red flags?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew some of the answers based on my own questions about the will's authenticity. Morrison opened a file and pulled out copies of both David's official will and the secret document that Catherine had revealed at the funeral. "First," he said, "the timing is suspicious. David and I updated his official will just 2 years ago, and he never mentioned any desire to create additional testamentary documents or to change the provisions we'd established for Emma and Jake." Morrison had been present for all of our estate planning discussions, and he'd seen how carefully David had considered the provisions for our children's future. The idea that David would have created a completely different will without consulting Morrison seemed unlikely. "Second," Morrison continued, "the language in this secret will is inconsistent with David's communication style and his previous legal documents. David was always very precise about legal terminology, but this document contains phrasing that's either unnecessarily complicated or oddly informal." Morrison showed me specific passages in the secret will where the language seemed inconsistent with David's usual approach to legal documents. As someone who had been married to David for 18 years, I could see what Morrison meant. The document didn't sound like David's voice. "Third, and most importantly," Morrison said, "the document wasn't executed in my office. It wasn't witnessed by my staff, and it doesn't follow the standard procedures that David always insisted on for important legal documents." This was the most damning evidence against the secret will's authenticity. David had been methodical about legal documentation throughout our marriage, always ensuring that important documents were properly executed and filed with appropriate legal oversight. "Are you saying you think the will is forged?" I asked directly. Morrison was careful in his response, clearly aware of the legal implications of making accusations without definitive proof. "I'm saying that there are enough irregularities to warrant a thorough investigation," he said, "and I'm recommending that we challenge the document's authenticity before the probate court." Morrison's recommendation aligned with my own instincts about the secret will. but it also meant that our family conflict was about to become a formal legal battle with all the publicity and expense that such challenges typically involve. What would an authenticity challenge involve? I asked. We'd need to have the document examined by forensic specialists who can analyze the paper, ink, signatures, and printing to determine when and how it was created, Morrison explained. We'd also need to investigate the circumstances under which the will was supposedly executed, who witnessed it, where it was signed, how it was stored. The forensic investigation would be expensive and time-consuming, but it would also provide definitive answers about whether the secret will was legitimate or fraudulent. There's one more thing, Morrison said, his expression growing more serious. If we can prove that this will is forged, then whoever created it could face criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and attempted theft. The possibility that Catherine could face criminal prosecution for creating a fraudulent will added a new dimension to our family conflict. This was no longer just about inheritance, it was about potential felony charges that could send my sister to prison. David, I said, using Morrison's first name in the informal way that had developed over years of professional relationship. I need to know the truth about Tyler's parentage before we proceed with any legal action. If Tyler really is David's son, then even if the will is forged, he might have legitimate claims to part of David's estate. Morrison nodded, clearly having anticipated this question. I've already arranged for DNA testing, he said. We'll need samples from Tyler and from David, which we can obtain from the funeral home before the final burial preparations are completed. The idea of DNA testing felt like a violation of David's memory and an invasion of Tyler's privacy, but it was also the only way to establish the biological facts that were central to Catherine's claims. What if Tyler refuses to provide a DNA sample? I asked. If Tyler refuses voluntarily, we can petition the court to compel testing as part of the estate proceedings, Morrison replied. But given Tyler's apparent willingness to reject the inheritance, I suspect he'll cooperate with testing that could clarify his actual relationship to David. Morrison was right about Tyler's likely cooperation. During our confrontation at my house, Tyler had seemed more interested in understanding the truth than in claiming an inheritance, suggesting that he would support any investigation that could provide clarity about his parentage. How long will the DNA testing and forensic analysis take? I asked. The DNA results should be available within 2 weeks, Morrison said. The forensic analysis of the will could take longer, potentially several months if we need to bring in specialists from outside the state. The timeline meant that Emma, Jake, and I would be living with uncertainty about our home and financial security for months while the investigation proceeded. But it also meant that Catherine and Tyler would be unable to take possession of any assets until the legal questions were resolved. David, I said, I want you to proceed with both the DNA testing and the forensic analysis. I need to know the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. Morrison's investigation began immediately, with DNA samples collected that same afternoon, and forensic specialists contracted to examine the secret will's physical characteristics. But the most revealing discoveries came not from scientific analysis, but from Morrison's investigation into the document's creation and storage. Within a week, Morrison had uncovered information that cast serious doubt on Catherine's story about how she'd obtained the secret will. Catherine claims that David gave her the will for safekeeping 6 months before his death, Morrison told me during our follow-up meeting. But I've spoken to David's colleagues, his business partners, and his close friends, and none of them recall any conversations about estate planning changes or concerns about his existing will. Morrison had also investigated the law firm whose letterhead appeared on the secret will, and his findings were damning. The law firm listed on the document, Patterson and Associates, does exist, but they have no record of David ever being a client, Morrison reported. More importantly, the attorney whose signature appears on the will, Thomas Patterson, died 3 years ago, which would make it impossible for him to have witnessed a document dated 6 months ago. The revelation that the secret will had been supposedly witnessed by a dead attorney was smoking gun evidence of forgery. But Morrison wasn't finished with his investigation. I've also had the document examined by a forensic handwriting expert, he continued. The signature that's supposed to be David's doesn't match the exemplars we have of his authentic signature from recent legal documents. The handwriting analysis provided additional evidence that the secret will was fraudulent, but the most conclusive proof came from the DNA testing results that arrived 2 weeks after our initial meeting. Tyler is not David's biological son, Morrison announced as he handed me the laboratory report. The DNA analysis excludes David as Tyler's father with 99.9% certainty. The DNA results meant that the entire foundation of Catherine's claim, Tyler's parentage, was false. Tyler was not David's son, which meant that the secret will was not only forged, but based on a completely fabricated premise. Sarah, Morrison said gently, I think we need to consider the possibility that Catherine has been planning this deception for a very long time. Morrison's suggestion that Catherine had been planning fraud for years was difficult to process, but it aligned with the evidence that was emerging from the investigation. The DNA results prove that Tyler isn't David's son, Morrison continued, but they also raise questions about how Catherine could have been so certain of his parentage that she was willing to stake a legal claim on it. The implication was that Catherine had known all along that Tyler wasn't David's son, which meant that her claim had been a deliberate lie rather than a mistake or misunderstanding. We need to confront Catherine with this evidence, I said, though I was dreading the conversation that would finally expose the scope of her deception. Before we do that, Morrison said, there's something else you need to know. I've been investigating Catherine's financial situation, and I've discovered that she's been struggling with debt for several years. Morrison showed me credit reports and financial documents that revealed Catherine had accumulated significant debt from her graphic design business and was facing potential bankruptcy. Catherine owes nearly $200,000 to various creditors, Morrison explained. She's been making minimum payments on credit cards and business loans, but her income hasn't been sufficient to reduce the principal balances. The financial pressure provided a clear motive for Catherine's attempt to claim David's estate through a forged will. With Tyler's supposed inheritance, she could have eliminated her debt and secured her financial future. David, I said, I want you to present this evidence to the district attorney's office. If Catherine committed fraud and forgery, she needs to face the legal consequences. Morrison nodded grimly. I've already been in contact with the prosecutor's office. They're prepared to file charges as soon as we've completed our documentation of the evidence. The prospect of my sister facing criminal charges was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary to protect Emma and Jake from further attempts to steal their inheritance. The confrontation with Catherine came 3 days later, when Morrison and I met with her and her attorney in Morrison's conference room. Catherine arrived with the same confident demeanor she'd displayed throughout the inheritance dispute, clearly unaware that her deception had been completely exposed. I hope we can resolve this matter without unnecessary litigation, Catherine said as she settled into her chair. Tyler is prepared to be generous with Emma and Jake's college expenses if you're willing to acknowledge the validity of David's will. The offer to be generous with my children's own inheritance was so tone-deaf that I had to control myself to avoid responding immediately. Morrison took the lead in presenting our evidence, starting with the DNA results that disproved Tyler's parentage. Catherine, Morrison said, handing her the laboratory report. The DNA testing confirms that Tyler is not David's biological son. Catherine's face went pale as she read the report, but she maintained her composure with what appeared to be genuine surprise. That's impossible, she said. Tyler has to be David's son. The timing, the resemblance, everything points to David being his father. The DNA testing is definitive, Morrison replied. Tyler is not biologically related to David. Catherine's attorney leaned over to read the DNA report, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he grasped the implications for his client's case. Furthermore, Morrison continued, our forensic analysis has determined that the will you presented is fraudulent. The signature is forged, the witness is deceased, and the law firm has no record of David as a client. Morrison presented each piece of evidence methodically, building an overwhelming case that the secret will was not only invalid, but criminally fraudulent. Catherine's response to the evidence was a mixture of denial and desperation that suggested she was finally realizing the magnitude of her legal jeopardy. Someone must have made mistakes in the testing, she said, her voice rising with panic. Tyler looks just like David. He has David's mannerisms. Everyone has always commented on their resemblance. Physical resemblance doesn't determine biological relationship, Morrison replied calmly. DNA testing is definitive, Catherine's attorney whispered urgently in her ear, clearly advising her to stop talking and consider her legal position, but Catherine seemed unable to accept that her elaborate deception had been exposed. Even if Tyler isn't David's biological son, she said desperately, David loved him like a son. David would have wanted Tyler to inherit his estate. David's actual will provides for Tyler's college education along with several other young people David cared about, Morrison replied. But David's primary responsibility was to his own children, Emma and Jake. The confrontation ended with Catherine's attorney requesting time to review the evidence and consult with his client about her legal options. But the damage was done. Catherine's claim to David's estate had been completely discredited, and she was now facing potential criminal prosecution for fraud and forgery. As Catherine left Morrison's office, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was difficult to process. Relief that Emma and Jake's inheritance was secure, but sadness that my sister had been willing to betray our family so completely for financial gain. The truth about Catherine's deception was about to become public, and I wasn't sure whether our family relationships could survive the revelation that one of us had been capable of such elaborate and sustained dishonesty. 6 months have passed since that devastating confrontation in David Morrison's office, and as I sit in my kitchen on this quiet Sunday morning, watching Tyler help Emma and Jake prepare pancakes for our weekly family breakfast, I'm amazed by how profoundly the truth has changed our understanding of love, loyalty, and what it really means to be family. The immediate aftermath of Catherine's exposed deception was as painful and complicated as I'd feared. The district attorney's office filed fraud and forgery charges against Catherine within a week of our meeting with Morrison, and the case quickly became public knowledge in our small town where David had been a respected community figure. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the inheritance fraud that detailed Catherine's elaborate scheme and the forensic evidence that had exposed her deception. The story was picked up by regional media outlets, and our family suddenly found ourselves at the center of a scandal that felt both deeply personal and uncomfortably public. Catherine pled guilty to fraud and forgery charges rather than face a trial that would have involved even more publicity and scrutiny. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution for the legal costs her deception had caused. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the community's shock at Catherine's betrayal of family trust during such a vulnerable time. But the legal resolution of Catherine's crimes was only the beginning of the healing process that our family needed to undergo. The revelation that Catherine had been planning to steal David's estate through forged documents and fabricated paternity claims had shattered the relationships and trust that had been central to our lives for decades. Emma and Jake were devastated not just by Catherine's betrayal, but by the realization that the aunt they'd loved and trusted had been willing to make them homeless and destitute for her own financial benefit. The teenagers who had always looked forward to family gatherings at Catherine's house suddenly felt uncomfortable and unsafe around someone who had demonstrated such calculated cruelty toward them. "I keep thinking about all the times she hugged us and told us she loved us," Emma said during one of our many conversations about Catherine's deception. "Was any of that real? Or was she just pretending to care about us while she was planning to steal our inheritance?" The question haunted all of us, because it forced us to reconsider every interaction we'd had with Catherine during the months when she must have been planning her fraud. Had her expressions of love and support been genuine, or had they been calculated manipulations designed to maintain access to our family while she prepared to betray us? But it was Tyler who was most devastated by the revelation of Catherine's deception, and for reasons that went far beyond the inheritance fraud. Tyler had spent 18 years believing that his father was either Marcus, the man who had abandoned him, or David, the uncle who had loved him but couldn't acknowledge him publicly. The DNA testing had revealed that David wasn't his biological father, but it had also raised new questions about his actual parentage that Catherine had been unable or unwilling to answer honestly. "She told me for 18 years that Marcus was my father," Tyler said during a conversation that took place in our living room 3 weeks after Catherine's sentencing. "Then she told me that David was my father. Now we know that David wasn't my father either. How can I believe anything she's ever told me about where I came from?" Tyler's identity crisis was compounded by his mother's legal troubles and the community's knowledge of her crimes. At 18, he was dealing not only with fundamental questions about his parentage, but also with the social stigma of being the son of someone who had attempted such a public and hurtful fraud. "Tyler," I said during that same conversation, "your mother's crimes don't reflect on you or define who you are. You've shown more integrity and moral courage in the past 6 months than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. Tyler's decision to reject the fraudulent inheritance and support Emma and Jake's rights had demonstrated a character that was independent of Catherine's influence and worthy of admiration, regardless of questions about his biological parentage. But Tyler was struggling with more than just identity questions and social embarrassment. Catherine's financial problems had become his problems when her graphic design business collapsed under the weight of legal bills and lost clients who no longer trusted her integrity. Tyler had been planning to start college in the fall, with the assumption that Catherine would be able to help with expenses through her business income. But Catherine's legal troubles had eliminated that possibility, leaving Tyler without the financial resources he needed for higher education. It was David Morrison who suggested a solution that would address both Tyler's financial needs and our family's desire to honor David's actual intentions toward the young man he'd cared about. David's official will includes a provision for Tyler's college education, Morrison reminded us during a meeting to finalize the estate settlement. David wanted to support Tyler's future, even though Tyler wasn't his biological son. We can honor that intention while also acknowledging the truth about Tyler's parentage. The provision in David's real will allocated $50,000 for Tyler's college expenses, a generous gift that reflected David's genuine affection for Tyler, while also recognizing that David's primary responsibility was to his own children. But Emma and Jake, who had been most directly threatened by Catherine's fraud attempt, surprised everyone by proposing an even more generous solution. Tyler shouldn't be punished for what his mother did, Emma said during a family meeting that included Tyler. Dad loved Tyler, and Tyler loved Dad. That relationship was real, even if the biology wasn't what people thought. Jake nodded in agreement. Tyler could have taken the fake inheritance and left us with nothing, but he chose to do the right thing even when it cost him personally. That means something. The teenagers proposed using additional funds from David's estate to establish a scholarship fund that would cover Tyler's full college expenses while also supporting other students from single-parent families who needed financial assistance for higher education. We could call it the David Henderson Memorial Scholarship, Emma suggested. It would honor Dad's memory while helping students who face challenges similar to what Tyler has dealt with. The proposal reflected the kind of thoughtful generosity that David had tried to model throughout his life, and it provided a way for our family to transform Catherine's attempted theft into something positive and meaningful. The scholarship fund became a reality with contributions not just from David's estate, but from community members who had been following our story and wanted to support Tyler's education despite his mother's crimes. The fund has now grown large enough to support multiple students each year, creating a lasting legacy that honors David's values while helping young people who might otherwise lack opportunities for higher education. But the most significant healing in our family came through the gradual rebuilding of relationships that had been damaged by Catherine's deception. Tyler had initially planned to move away from our town after high school, feeling that staying would subject him to constant reminders of his mother's crimes and his own complicated family history. But Emma and Jake had convinced him to stay, arguing that he belonged with the family that had actually raised him regardless of biological relationships. "You've been our brother in every way that matters for 18 years, Jake told Tyler during one of their conversations. "The DNA test doesn't change that. If anything, it proves that family is about choice and love, not just genetics." Tyler's decision to remain part of our family and attend the local community college with scholarship support has enriched all of our lives in ways that I couldn't have anticipated. He brings perspective and maturity to family discussions, serves as a bridge between Emma and Jake when they disagree, and continues to be the kind of positive role model that David had hoped he would become. More importantly, Tyler's presence in our lives has helped all of us understand that love and family bonds are more powerful than deception and betrayal. Catherine's fraud attempt had threatened to destroy relationships that had been built over 18 years, but those relationships proved to be strong enough to survive even deliberate attempts to manipulate and exploit them. The hardest part of our healing process has been deciding how to handle our relationship with Catherine herself. After her sentencing, Catherine moved to another state to start over somewhere that her crimes weren't public knowledge. She's made several attempts to contact Tyler and to apologize for the damage her deception caused, but Tyler has chosen not to respond to her overtures. "I need time to figure out who I am before I can deal with who she is," Tyler explained during one of our conversations about Catherine's attempts to rebuild their relationship. Maybe someday I'll be ready to hear her explanations and apologies, but right now I need to focus on moving forward. Tyler's approach to his relationship with Catherine has been mature and thoughtful, recognizing that forgiveness is a process that can't be rushed, and that protecting his own emotional well-being needs to be his priority as he builds his adult identity. For my part, I've chosen to maintain minimal contact with Catherine, while focusing on supporting Tyler's adjustment to his new understanding of his family history. Catherine's betrayal of our relationship was profound and deliberate, and while I don't wish her ill, I also don't feel obligated to maintain the close sisterly bond that she exploited for her own purposes. The most surprising development in our family's healing process has been Tyler's investigation into his actual biological parentage. With support from Emma and Jake, Tyler decided to pursue DNA testing through genealogy services that might help identify his real father. The results revealed that Tyler's biological father was someone Catherine had dated briefly during her separation from Marcus, a college classmate named Michael Torres, who had moved to Colorado after graduation and lost touch with Catherine. Michael had never known about Tyler's existence, but when Tyler contacted him through social media, he was eager to establish a relationship with the son he'd never known he had. "It's strange," Tyler told us after his first phone conversation with Michael. "I spent 18 years thinking Marcus was my father but feeling no connection to him. Then I spent a day thinking David was my father and feeling like that explained everything about our relationship. Now, I'm talking to Michael, who actually is my biological father, and it feels interesting, but not earth-shattering." Tyler's perspective on biological parentage has been shaped by his experience of loving and being loved by David, regardless of genetic relationships. He's curious about Michael and interested in developing a relationship with him, but he doesn't see biological connection as the defining factor in family relationships. "David was my father in every way that mattered," Tyler said recently. "He taught me how to be a good person. He supported my education and my dreams, and he loved me unconditionally. Biology is just one factor in relationships, and it's not the most important one." Tyler's wisdom about family relationships has influenced all of us as we've worked to rebuild trust and connection after Catherine's betrayal. We've learned that the bonds we choose to maintain and nurture are often stronger than the ones we inherit through genetics or marriage. Our weekly family breakfasts have become a tradition that symbolizes our commitment to chosen family over biological obligation. Tyler, Emma, Jake, and I gather every Sunday morning to share food, conversation, and the kind of easy affection that develops between people who choose to love each other despite complicated circumstances. David's memory is present at these gatherings not through sadness or grief, but through the values and relationships he helped create during his lifetime. Tyler's presence at our table honors David's investment in his development, while Emma and Jake's acceptance of Tyler reflects the inclusive love that David modeled throughout his life. The scholarship fund that bears David's name has become another way for our family to honor his memory while supporting young people who face challenges similar to those Tyler has overcome. We've helped 12 students access higher education over the past 2 years, and several of them have stayed in touch to share their academic progress and career achievements. "Dad would be proud of what we've built from such a terrible situation," Emma said during our most recent scholarship award ceremony. "He always believed that good could come from difficult circumstances if people were willing to work for positive outcomes." Emma's insight captures what I've learned about resilience and recovery during these difficult months. Catherine's fraud attempt could have destroyed our family relationships and left us bitter and suspicious of everyone around us. Instead, it forced us to examine what really matters in family connections and to choose love over cynicism. Tyler's decision to reject a fraudulent inheritance in favor of family loyalty demonstrated that character is more important than genetics in determining who deserves our love and trust. Emma and Jake's willingness to share their inheritance with someone who had been threatened by the same fraud showed that generosity and fairness can triumph over self-interest. And David's memory has been honored not through the inheritance he left, but through the values he instilled in all of us during his lifetime. As I watch Tyler help Emma and Jake prepare breakfast this morning, I'm grateful for the unexpected family that has emerged from betrayal and deception. We're different than we were before Catherine's fraud attempt, but we're also stronger and more intentional about the relationships we maintain. Tyler will always carry questions about his early family history and his mother's capacity for deception, but he's also surrounded by people who love him for who he is, rather than who they think he should be. Emma and Jake have learned that family loyalty sometimes requires difficult choices, and that protecting the people you love might mean confronting the people who threaten them. And I've learned that the most important inheritance David left wasn't money or property. It was the example of how to love people completely while maintaining the integrity to do what's right, even when it's painful. Catherine's attempt to steal David's legacy through fraud and deception ultimately failed not because of DNA testing or forensic analysis, but because the people David loved chose to honor his values rather than pursue personal gain. That's a legacy that no forged will can steal, and no biological test can diminish. It's the kind of inheritance that grows stronger when it's shared and becomes more valuable when it's tested by adversity. David's greatest gift to our family wasn't what he left us in his will. It was teaching us how to choose love over selfishness, truth over deception, and family over biology when those choices matter most.